we've talked a lot about freedom and liberty, but what about what precedes it? What about the act of being freed? What about emancipation? What about the end of tyranny? In other words, what about liberation? Because it's difficult to understand freedom, it seems to me, without having the memory and the knowledge of that very particular feeling, the absolute elation of liberation. In France, la libération is a defined moment in contemporary history. And it lasted a few weeks, a few months. And it started on a very early morning on the 6th of June, 1944, also known as D-Day, when 150,000 magnificent allies came to our rescue. So briefly, the elation of liberation. Friday, the 25th of August, 1944, at dawn, the young composer Maurice Jarre, he was 19 at the time, you may remember his film soundtracks, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago. And I met him a few years before he died, and he told me about this morning. So he was 19, and he suddenly woke up in the two-room flat that he shared with his aunt on the Avenue d'Orléans, the large avenue linking the south gate of Paris to Notre Dame. I quote him, "I could feel tremors. The whole building was shaking. We thought it was the German armored division sent by Hitler to crush the Paris insurrection. We thought we were finished. We were petrified. The roaring sound became greater and greater. I opened the window and crawled onto the balcony. I looked. When I realized what it was, it took my breath away. General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division was entering Paris. There were no words to describe what we felt at that instant in time." A few hours later, that same day, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, leaving his left bank hotel room on the Rue de Seine, ran towards the Boulevard Saint-Michel. The philosopher was one among hundreds of Parisians now crowding the pavements to get a glimpse of their liberators. The Free French and the Spanish Republicans enlisted with General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division started pouring into the boulevards, while American, British, and Canadian soldiers from the US 4th Infantry Division were entering the city from the east. Sartre watched his liberator. This is what he wrote. "They looked, screamed, smiled. They waved at us with their fingers forming the V of victory, and we could all feel our hearts beating as one. There were no civilians, there were no soldiers. There was one free people." And it's always the details that are the most moving. One tank, baptized simply Paris, had a live snow-white rabbit proudly resting next to the driver's hatch. On another was a portrait of Hitler with the word merde written across it. As for the Spanish Republicans, they had named their tank Guernica. So now what to do with this liberation and with what Simone de Beauvoir called the orgy of fraternity? Paris in the late 1940s and the early 1950s was this laboratory of ideas, this sort of beehive of utopian projects and initiatives. And of course, many failed miserably, but others were more successful. So I have chosen 3. March 1948. The prodigiously prolific Jean-Paul Sartre was now ready to cross the Rubicon. He would make the ultimate radical pledge and found a political party. Imagine that, Jean-Paul Sartre as party leader. Well, with 2 well-known resistants, Sartre created the RDR, the Rassemblement Démocratique et Révolutionnaire, in other words, the Democratic and Revolutionary Alliance, a sort of revolutionary center. And the idea was to unite the non-communist left under one banner and to promote an independent Europe as a bridge between the 2 blocs, the United States and the Soviet Union. The press conference to launch it was attended by more than 1,000 journalists from France and abroad, and was followed just a week later by the party's first public meeting. The communists sensing the danger, increased their attacks on Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. Many communist newspapers published salacious, sensationalist stories about their private lives, alluding to orgies. But this did not prevent the RDR from gaining in popularity. Personalities joined forces with Sartre. Albert Camus gave his support. The black American writer, Richard Wright, who lived in Paris at the time, became a member. Even André Breton, the Pope of Surrealism, gave his support. The conservative daily newspaper and Gaullist conservative newspaper Le Figaro wrote favorably about the RDR, and Le Monde chose to support it, calling it l'alternative. Only the New Yorker correspondent in Paris, the formidable Janet Flanner, could not help being sarcastic. She wrote, Jean-Paul Sartre has founded a political party. Heaven help us. Sartre's political ideas are less clear, if more optimistic, than his novels. His talent, his scholarly mind, his French essence, and his hypersensitivity to Europe's dilapidation give momentary importance to his political hopes. Sartre's party declares that it expects to collect in the next 6 months 100,000 followers. If words were all, its followers should number millions from all over this earth. Well, she was right. Tensions were simmering within the RDR. For how long could they still occupy the political middle ground? Some in the party were ever more anti-communist, and Sartre was anti-Gaullist. So a year later, the party split up. The neutralist attempt had failed. There was no third way. Sartre wrote in his diary, "The RDR has imploded. Tough. New and definite lessons in realism. One doesn't give birth to a movement. It did correspond to an abstract necessity defined by an objective situation. However, it did not answer a real need in people. This is the reason why, in the end, the people didn't support it." So the end of the RDR was the end of a dream, and Sartre, a few years later, would eventually take sides and embrace communism. November 1948. A redhead, pleasant, shrewd, and slightly corny Air Force veteran named Gary Davis entered the Paris scene and made world news. The 27-year-old idealist thought the solution to the Cold War was to create a world government in order to dilute nationalism once and for all. The UN needed to have its power extended. To preserve the peace was not good enough a mandate for the UN. The UN needed to be able to impose peace. So to dramatize this young man decided to become the first world citizen by giving up his American passport in front of the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, where the UN was meeting for the first time. So in 1948, an American passport was the most cherished document on earth. Anyone who would want to give one up was regarded as crazy. He wanted to prove how ridiculous any sort of identification papers really were. After he tore up his passport, the police arrested him for not having proper identification. A star was born. UN sessions were open to the public, and seats in the balcony were allocated to whoever made a request. Everything had been carefully plotted. So when the Soviet Union's high representative took to the podium to speak, Davis got up and shouted, "One government for one world," while his young friends threw leaflets on the UN delegates seated below. The military police arrived, but 3 did not run fast enough and were arrested. Among them, Albert Camus. So a few days later, as you do, Albert Camus and Gary Davis improvised a press conference in a cafe near the UN at the Trocadero. It was followed by a public meeting a week later, attended by 20,000 people. Gary Davis spoke, Albert Camus, Richard Wright again spoke. And the world media reported their every word in print and on the airwaves. There was no escaping this new utopian, Parisian utopia. Albert Einstein sent a cablegram to Monsieur Davis, and it said, I am eager to express to the young war veteran Davis my recognition of the sacrifice he has made for the well-being of humanity. He has made out of himself a displaced person in order to fight for the natural rights of those who are the mute evidence of the low moral level of our time. Letters from the whole world started pouring in, and soon Davis was renting 10 rooms in his Left Bank hotel to accommodate his staff, all volunteers. Again, the utopia did not last long. Although Gary Davis kept issuing world citizens' passports until the very end. 10 years ago, in 2012, he sent a world passport to Julian Assange, and then another to Edward Snowden in care of the Russian authorities. So, if there was no stopping Cold War politics, a new project for Europe would nonetheless soon take form. On a grey spring morning in 1950, the American journalist based in Paris, Theodore H. White, had a meeting with a French senior civil servant called Jean Monnet. This is how White described Jean Monnet: a full-chested, round-faced, acid Frenchman with a needle-pointed nose. And that man was among the statesmen he met in his career who impressed him most. I quote White: "Jean Monnet introduced me to a craft which I have since come to consider the most important in the world, the brokerage of ideas. Monnet was a businessman by origin, cool, calculating, caustic, but he did love ideas and could sell ideas to almost anyone. Ideas were his private form of sport, threading an idea into the slipstream of politics, then into government, then into history. He talked about how and when to plant ideas like a gardener. He coaxed people in government to think. There were few counterparts to Monnet in other countries." Theodore White invented the phrase power broker to describe Jean Monnet, and it's an expression that passed into general use. 6 weeks before the invasion of Korea, Jean Monnet placed on the agenda of world politics the idea of a united Europe, an old idea, but this time clothed with a plan. What Monnet was proposing was this: a new coal and steel community in which not only Frenchmen and Germans, but Italians, Belgians, Dutch would share resources, facilities, and markets. In other words, Monnet was suggesting the creation of a common market. Jean Monnet sold the idea to the French Foreign Minister, Robert Schuman, who in turn sold it to the US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. I quote Theodore H. White: "Washington recognized that Jean Monnet, this businessman turned dreamer, turned planner, was the most imposing leader in his country. Monnet's prestige in French politics was akin to that of George Marshall's in American politics. He belonged to no political party and enjoyed the confidence of all, except the communists. Thus, only he had the temerity and prestige to present to both American and French governments the plan that would give flesh to an idea which ultimately both would have to accept as the substitute for a grand settlement of peace. So to conclude, those moments of liberation in our history generate crazy ideas, which mostly fail, but sometimes succeed. So creativity and freedom are feeding each other, and all we need is to keep trying."
Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. So how can we explain the difference in handling the post-war era of liberation between London and Paris? Because London was a more gloomy place than Paris, which was brimming with ideas.
I'm quite wary of comparisons between London and Paris, especially these days. But yes, London was a dreary place just after the war. I mean, it's interesting, you know, Italy, Spain, Germany, if we're looking at our European neighbors, we're busy just rebuilding, reconstructing, rethinking what had just happened was London and Britain having been so magnificent, having provided so much effort and being that consciousness of that beacon of civilization in Europe. Just after the war, instead of seizing the opportunity to lead, intellectually, artistically, sort of retreated. I mean, it's a feeling that we know coming from our British friends, retreating in their island. But so that's the reason Paris became that epicenter, if you'd like, of those ideas. I mean, as I said, many failed, but at least there was an attempt. And as I said, some succeeded. And then, of course, London came back in the fray in the 60s.
Thank you very, very much.